Hello, everybody. My name is Emily. I am a double major in nursing and public health at Nazareth University, and y'all are tuning in for my debut into the podcast world. I've never made a podcast before. This is my first one, and it might be my last, but I guess we will see together how this goes. Today I'm going to be discussing something very important, not only in the nursing world, but in everybody's day-to-day life, and that is communication. At NAS, I have taken a variety of different classes that have helped me understand why communication is so important. But 3 of these classes stood out to me specifically, and they were a nursing-specific class, Therapeutic Communication, a public health-specific class, Bioethics, and just a general course I had to take was a literature class called Youth Explore the World. These classes sound and are wildly different from each other, but they do come together quite nicely for the purpose of this project, communication. It's more than just a skill, but it is a responsibility that we have. So I interviewed 3 professionals from 3 different fields, 2 of which I am related to, and one of them is a really good family friend. My father, Eric Frey, my stepdad, Mike Muscarella, and that really good family friend, her name is Pat Decaro. They all have wildly different jobs, but they all have so much wisdom to share with you guys about communication. I asked all of them the same 5 questions, and so the way I'm going to format this is as I touch upon each of the classes that are the foundation for this project, I'll input those interviews accordingly. I'm really excited to share the wisdom that they shared with me. They have so many years under their belt. They're really intelligent people, and I am so excited to show you guys how intelligent they are in all the things they said. So, yeah, let's get into it. All right, so as a primarily nursing student, we're going to jump right into the nursing aspect of this project. Therapeutic Communication is a class that you take before your medically specific classes at NAS. The idea behind that being you want a foundation before you're going and actually doing it. So learning how to communicate with patients before you start communicating with patients. So in this class, we talked a lot about building trust with patients, specifically in the moments where they feel vulnerable and scared and they're in pain. We talked about tone, why that's important, why eye contact is important, why sometimes not giving eye contact depending on the patient and how it's going to be different for everybody. One thing that really, really stuck with me is the idea that listening itself is an intervention. In nursing school, we talk a lot about nursing interventions, and the idea that just sitting there, being quiet and listening to what your patient has to say, making them feel heard, that can reduce anxiety, it increases their cooperation, and it just overall improves their outcomes. In class, we practiced a lot. We used open-ended questions, reflecting patients' feelings, validating patients' experiences, just generally building rapport and promoting a relationship with that patient, which just in hand promotes their healing. So yeah, the first person I interviewed is my father, Eric Frey. So I'm really excited for you guys to hear what he's got to say about all this. I'm here with my father, Eric Frey. He is an MCC graduate working as a registered nurse for a travel agency in critical care units. He is also one of the youth leaders for Willowbrook Christian Church in Victor, New York. Hello, Father.
Hello, daughter.
So we're talking about communication today. How would you define communication in your own words?
I would define communication as the process by which we transmit information to one another.
Okay. Do age, culture, or background affect how people communicate? And if so, how do you handle that in your work?
Yeah, 100%. Obviously, being a nurse, I have to deal with people of all ages and all cultures and all backgrounds. And everybody has been raised differently, right? Everyone has been raised with their own set of how they have learned to communicate and how they have learned to accept communication from other people. So a lot of the times it's just figuring out what is the best way to communicate with each person individually. Like, for instance, one of the questions that we first ask people on admission is, how do you best learn new things? So is it by reading? Is it by having somebody explain something to you, like a demonstration? And, people have different answers for how they're going to learn new information. So, effectively, how is the best way to communicate, some new piece of information that they're going to have to learn related to their hospital stay.
Does language affect your communication with patients?
100%, yeah. So sometimes we have patients who English is not their first language, right? Like you can imagine, like they just have, if it's Spanish or anything else, I think Spanish is the most common, but in the hospital we use interpreter services. So if English is not their first language, we have this service where we can put a video screen right in front of the person, and then they have someone speaking to them in their own language who can then translate that information, back into English for us. And that's super important because you need to be able to understand, what the person is feeling, especially when it comes to their health, right? Especially when it comes to what the problems they're dealing with. So, yeah, language is it can be a big issue, but, we've obviously have taken great steps to make sure that we're able to effectively communicate with people who don't speak the same language as us.
So you work in critical care units in various places. When a critical moment happens and there is a barrier like language, how do you go about that?
So if communication is it'd be different in that particular aspect. Most of the time, that critical communication, that's going to be between doctors and nurses, mm-hmm. right? And,
how do you go about that?
So that's interesting, right? In nursing, we do a lot of what we call closed loop communication, which you've probably learned about.
Yeah.
Yeah, right. So in a code situation, for instance, if someone has stopped breathing or they've lost a pulse, and if we're giving medications or if we're giving shocks, for whatever it is, there's a doctor in the room who's running the code, and then the rest of the team, the rest of the nurses and whoever else is in the room, respiratory, and the doctor is giving out orders for medication, and then we close the loop by repeating what the doctor has just said to us.
Okay.
So for instance, if we're giving 1 milligram of epinephrine, the doctor will give 1 milligram of epi, and then whoever the medication nurse is will say giving 1 milligram of epi, and then they'll say 1 milligram of epi given. Right. So
okay.
So the whole time, like they're telling you as they're doing it, like if it's it's time to for a pulse check. So and in that case, for like if we're checking for a pulse, we'll call that out like a few seconds ahead of time. So the doctor will say, where are we on time? And the recorder, whoever's keeping time will say, 20 seconds till pulse check. And so then with like 5 seconds left, they'll say 5 seconds till pulse check.
Okay.
And then they'll stop and the doctor will say pulse check. Everybody stops the compressions, everything, do the pulse check. People will say no pulse, I don't have a pulse. I don't have a pulse here. People feeling in different places for pulses, resume compressions or whatever's next, or, if it's time to give a shock, we say exactly what we're doing for the shock, right? Which, these days is mostly the pads are hooked up and you're pressing a button, right? You already have it there and you're just pressing a button, but
clear.
Right, clear. Yeah, exactly.
Okay. Okay, so obviously a big part of communicating is getting through hard conversations. Are there phrases or approaches that you use to make those like hard and tough conversations a little bit more productive?
I don't think there are specific phrases, but there are definitely approaches. So I think in a tough conversation in the hospital, if it's a tough conversation with a patient, I think listening is one of the most important things. Like, the communication goes both ways, right? So I have some piece of information or hard conversation that I need to have with a patient, but I also need to know how they're feeling about that, right? And so, in order for us to for the communication to go both ways, I need to be a good listener. I need to be willing to just sit there and soak up whatever it is that they want to talk about. Sometimes that can be with a very sick patient. Sometimes that can be even with a very difficult patient. Because if you're in the hospital, that's like one of the worst days of your life, right? And so it changes the dynamic of the conversation. It changes the dynamic of the communication. It's not just like you're not out, talking to the barista where you're picking up your coffee, right? Like this is someone who's going through something, and especially in critical care, like these are sick patients, right? Some of these people are really, really sick. And so you need to be able to understand it from where they're coming from and, try and present the information to them with empathy and in a way that respects their personhood and their choices, and it's their life that's on the line or whatever that we're talking about. So
yeah. As a member of your church, I'm sure that you have also had to have some hard conversations with some individuals. How do you navigate those kinds of conversations whether it's you confronting someone about something or being confronted about something? How do you think communication plays a role in how those turn out?
Sometimes, so I think listening applies there also, but the thing that popped in my head when you just said that was a lot of it is remaining calm. Like people, when being confronted, can get very worked up, right? Emotions can run very high. And if you're able to stay calm and state facts and just present the information with as little extra emotion, right? Like I can't be angry, I have to do it without anger. And so even if it's a situation where it might be something that could make me mad or has made me mad in that moment, that's not going to help, right? Yeah. I'm trying to get through this hard conversation I need to have with somebody, and I need to just stay flat. I need to stay calm.
Yeah.
Yeah.
As a nurse and a youth leader, you talk to very many different kinds of people. So how do you adapt your communication when talking to people with different levels of experience or different levels of understanding, whether that be patients or children?
Yeah, so I don't get a lot of children as patients, but yeah. Right, I don't. Pediatrics is just not my thing very often. Occasionally, every once in a while, but more often it's working with youth in the youth ministry setting, right? And so, as far as it goes with, as far as age is related, or because age is related to the different levels of understanding, right? Like if I'm working with a junior high aged teen or preteen, they're not going to nearly have the same understanding as a young adult or an adult or somebody else who I've been teaching or working with, right? And so the examples that I give, even the words that I use, need to be more tailored towards what they would understand, right? So I might have a tendency to, want to use a better vocabulary or something, right? Like, pressed up with big words or something, right? But if I'm talking with a 12-year-old or something who's not going to know, and I catch myself doing it sometimes, even in youth group, right? I'll say a word and I'll be like, do you guys know what that means? And they'll just look at me like glazed eyes. And I'm like, okay, let me back this up and make this a word that's more understandable for you. So that's certainly part of it. What was that? I was going to say something about the hospital setting too. Just about how I talk differently to people of different ages in the hospital too. Like, if I am speaking to somebody who is like older than me, especially significantly older than me, there's a level of respect that I'm gonna have for them. Like, I respect everybody. Don't get me wrong. Like, I respect everybody, but like, if I have a 90-year-old patient that has lived a ton of life and a ton of experiences, I recognize that that's way more life than I've lived, right? And way more experiences and whatever else. And so I feel like that could affect the way that I communicate with them, just with a deeper level of respect I get. Like, I'm going to respect everybody, but just something that recognizes that, and that's part of like how I was raised too, is respect your elders, right? Like, that's part of how grandma raised me, right?
Yeah.
Was respect your elders. And so I think that I would just treat them a little bit differently, even though I'm still going to respect everybody.
Right. One of the things that we talked about in therapeutic communication class is that while we're treating everybody the same in the sense that we are trying to help them to the best of our possible ability, we are still going to cater our conversations and interactions to the individual patient. And it's the patient-centered care that we're like it's really drilled into our brains, is that like the way that I'm going to communicate to a child is not the way that I'm going to communicate to a 30 or 40-year-old adult. And the words I'm going to use are going to be different. And the way that I'm going to tell them about what I'm doing is going to be different. Because if I tell a child I'm giving you acetaminophen, they don't know what that means. I'm going to say, I'm giving you a medication that's going to make you feel better right now. This is going to make your headache go away. It's going to bring your fever down because you're hot. It's going to make you less hot. Whereas if I'm talking to a 30-year-old, I'm going to be like, you know what acetaminophen is. So I'm not going to be like, this medication is going to make your hot head less hot. So
this when you're talking, that made me think of, sometimes I have patients who the doctor will come in the room and they'll explain in very doctor terms what's going on with them, right?
Yeah.
And patients, sometimes the doctors are usually very good about saying, do you have any questions? But people are afraid to ask doctors questions. A lot of people do not ask doctors questions. And so the nurses, we have a better relationship with patients. We just do, right? We're with them more of the time. We spend a lot more time with them than doctors do. So they'll be like lots of times I've had people just say, hey, could you just explain that to me a little differently? Like, could you just kind of tell me what the doctor just said and like explain to me a little differently? And sure, of course. Yeah, I'm happy to do that. And especially that's true where like, made me think of people where like English is a second language. So they speak English and maybe even well, but if it's their second language, doctors can talk fast sometimes and they're blowing through stuff and they have more patients to see and they have a schedule and they're trying to get through it. And so, just for us as the nurses to be able to slow down and take the time to really, and I don't want to like dumb it down is not the right phrasing, right? But just explain it in simpler terms, right?
Yes.
And not medical jargon. You can do without medical jargon, right? And not all of the big fancy words and whatever, and
right.
So
yeah. Okay, so last question here, since we've hit quite a few bases about how communication works for different kinds of people and different approaches for different kinds of conversations. why, in your opinion, is communication important? And like not only in your professional life, but also just as a general term.
Communication is like the basis of everything that we do. All of our life is communication. We're constantly giving out information and receiving information, and everyday life, right? Every time we go through a drive-through, or every time that we have an interaction at a store, or there's just everything is communication. And think about how much of like our lives are built upon like the furtherance, like as we gain more knowledge, it's built on, it's like stepping stones, right? And so we build and we build and we build. Well, all of that has come through communication, right? We even if you go way back to like the beginning of like cave drawings or whatever, right? Like they communicated danger by drawing pictures of bad things on the caves, right? And I feel all of life is us moving along in our quest for being better, whatever that means for people.
Yeah.
But we do that by communicating what we've learned, and by receiving communication from what other people have learned.
Yeah.
And that knowledge makes us better humans, better people, and well, hopefully it does. Hopefully we're using that, to
the greater good of people.
The greater good, exactly right. Yeah, I'm sure we don't always do that, but yeah, you can't grow as a person without communication.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much for your time today. Good luck in all of your nursing endeavors and such things.
Thank you.
All right, so the next part of this is my bioethics part. It's my public health part. Bioethics was a really interesting and really hard class, but I think it really shows why communication is so important during hard, intense conversation, emotionally charged conversations, ethically complicated situations and conversations, delivering bad news, discussing end-of-life care, helping a family member make a really impossible decision. The way that we communicate to people really shapes the experience of the conversation. We can build trust, we can have clarity, we can offer comfort to people, or we can leave people confused or hurt or just pissed off. One of the things that we talked about before we got into any of our actual material was that the conversations we're going to have don't have easy answers, and the things that we're going to be talking about are emotionally charged conversations. And it's important to be honest, but it's also important to be compassionate to what other people are saying and other people's opinions. It's not about medically correct. It's about making people feel supported and respected, even when it's kind of a difficult thing to hear. So I thought it would be really interesting to get, a teacher's point of view on this. So here is my stepdad. Okay, I am here with my bonus dad, Mike Muscarella. He is a high school government teacher and a musician. Hello, Mike.
Heidi-ho.
How would you define communication in your own words?
Communication is making meaning of thoughts and transmitting those thoughts and their meanings to someone else.
I like that.
Thank you.
Do age, culture, or background affect how people communicate? And how do you handle that in your jobs?
Absolutely. I work with 17 and 18-year-olds during the day. In the evening, I work with anyone from 30 to 65-year-olds who regularly act as 17 or 18-year-olds. And I recently had many conversations with my late father, who also required different ways of communicating as he got older. There are things that a senior in high school can process that my 5-year-old niece can't process. And if I were to explain a topic, say, if I were to explain this past weekend the No Kings national protest that was in 2,000 locations around the United States.
Yeah.
That protest I would explain very differently to a high school student than I would to my 5-year-old niece.
Right.
Beyond just word choice, I would also be looking at meaning and tone. So to my seniors, we're looking at styles of protest. How is protest a form of communication? Who are these protests for? Who do they represent? To a 5-year-old, like my niece, I would be looking at, why is it important for you to say what's on your mind? Why is it, what are the many ways that you can say how you feel? It's the same core, but you're using very different language to communicate that core.
Yeah.
A 5-year-old will use a lot of feelings and colors,
Yeah.
and whereas a 17-year-old or an 18-year-old is still very much talking about feelings, but is going to do everything possible to make it not sound like they're talking about feelings, because by the time you hit 17 or 18, feelings are what you have when you're uneducated or unintellectual, or
Right.
None of that I believe is true. But a senior is going to try and back it up with fact and
Right.
research and numbers, whereas a 5-year-old will be looking at, how does it make me feel? And oddly enough, I've found that as we approach the last stages of our life, we, in ways, revert back to to that earlier form of, how do I feel?
Yeah, when I was interviewing one of my other interviewees, she mentioned that it kind of goes like the way you talk to a younger aged individual, to a middle aged, to an elderly individual, and it kind of is like the younger and elderly kind of have similar, simpler, direct terms, where it's a little bit different for the middle aged.
What's really interesting, I'm finding as I'm like knee deep in that middle age, is how profoundly wise those feelings actually are.
Mm-hmm.
And the difference between the 75-year-old and the 5-year-old, like you might feel like you have to talk in the same way, but when the 75-year-old is talking about feeling, they're talking about it in a far more profound, nuanced, and deep way than the 5-year-old is.
Yep.
Even though, so it kind of makes you feel like all the stuff in the middle, where you feel like you have to justify everything with facts and numbers and what have you, is actually that's the dumb part.
Yeah.
And that the kids and the elderly are the ones who actually are tapping into the real wisdom.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, on to my next question. Are there phrases or approaches you use to make tough conversations more productive? You are a government teacher, so I'm sure that you have to have a lot of, difficult conversations because the world is difficult right now and our government is difficult right now. So
Sure. I mean, I sent you a text of what happened in the last 5 days.
Yeah, yes you did.
It's enough to stun an ox. I think the best way to approach difficult conversations is with I statements. It's so cheesy, it's so self-help booky, but when I have a student, am I allowed to swear?
Yeah, it's college.
Okay. Well, I'm quoting a student.
Okay.
When I have a student who ended the semester by saying, "I'm so glad that this fucking class is done, so I don't have to take liberal shit from people like you," the way that I would address that comment would be to say, "Help me understand what you mean by liberal shit. Like, could teach me what you mean by that."
Yeah.
As opposed to saying, you're just a narcissistic little 17-year-old who's very entitled and whose father works for the district and, oh, aren't you sweet? Like, none of that's productive. But if I can say, help me understand X, it puts the person who's answering in the driver's seat of the answer, and makes it so that I'm the person who is submitting to their answer. And one of the things that we have just lost in American culture is this idea of the power of submitting to someone's teaching. When you are submitting, you are in a situation of power. You are, especially when you're in a teacher-student situation or a counselor, therapist, nurse situation, when you can say, "Help me understand what you mean by I'm in terrible pain." It's a way for you to give that person autonomy and voice without judgment.
Yes.
And do I think that kid was completely full of shit? Not completely. I think he's echoing his parents, and they're full of shit. But I also am recognizing that I'm full of shit. So why don't, if I allow myself to have this person explain to me from a teaching role what they mean, then they're getting their 5 minutes without me judging them. Yeah. And it diffuses things. You'll see counselors say that a lot. You'll see like mental health emergency people.
Diffusing.
Help me understand. When you or when you say, "I hear you saying this. Is that what you mean?" You're diffusing a tense conversation, and that can be very helpful. It's not as much fun because it's much more fun to stoke the conversation.
Yeah.
But it's more productive.
Yes.
To say, "Help me understand."
Yes. Well, how do you adapt your communication when you are talking to people with different levels of experience or understanding?
It's easier as a teacher to do that because one of the things that I have to do is get to know my students. So I try and find a language that they speak and speak that language. If you're a sporty kid, I'm going to talk about, don't give up, we play all 60 minutes here. Or sometimes you got to be in the penalty box. It's okay. You're not going to hit every pitch. You do that. If you're a theater kid, hey, everything's a dress rehearsal. Don't worry about it. You're in a costume. You're playing a character. It's totally fine. You can be up front. You try and find their discourse, how they talk, and use that language. But the other thing that I try and do is use illustration. I use metaphor ad nauseum, much to my wife's chagrin. Your lovely mother. She'll sometimes say, "I don't need a metaphor." Cool. But when you're trying to explain a concept to someone who has a different kind of experience, often you have to use some sort of mutually understood story. How a lot of people like to communicate through pop culture references. That's the same thing. It's a commonly understood metaphor. You know, when you say the name of a politician, that politician, we're not talking about the person, we're talking about what they stand for. We're talking about the issue or the stupid thing they said in the news. And so that politician becomes the mutually understood illustration that we can communicate through, like the Rosetta Stone of translation.
Yeah.
And, you know, with students, a lot of times that's what you have to do.
Yeah.
And it is always, with all of these questions, all of which are good, by the way, and deserving of an A++ by anyone evaluating, the onus of understanding is on the person with power. That's really, really important. If I'm looking age, culture, background, if I am the nurse and I'm working in a hospice, the nurse is the one with power. The person in the bed doesn't have power. Thus, the nurse is the one who's responsible for understanding the person in the bed, not the other way around.
Right.
As the teacher, I'm the one in the classroom with power. So my job is to submit to the students and, well, to their learning process, and not try and say, you all have to learn the way that I'm telling you.
Yeah.
And when talking about different ages and experiences, in this case, for better or worse, and in our culture, it tends to be better, I am a cisgendered, white, male, middle class, highly educated. I am the seat of power.
Yeah.
So it is my job to adapt my language in order to understand someone who isn't in the bullseye of American culture.
Right.
You know, it is not my job to have an African American person explain African American culture to me. It's my job to submit and listen. It's my job to adapt to my language so that I understand.
Right.
It's not their job. And so with communication, there's always the elements of power. And whoever is in power, whoever has the cultural or educational or political power, it is incumbent on them to work to understanding and not the other way around.
Right.
By doing so, you will invite people to mutual understanding.
Yeah. Last question is, in your opinion, why is communication important, not just in your work, but in life in general?
Because we live in community. Within the word communication is the same root word that is community. If we lived alone in the woods, which does sound so good, but if we lived alone in the woods, we would have we would not have human communication.
Right.
Because we're not communing. It's a monologue.
Yeah, it's true.
We live alone. We would be communing with nature, but we would be speaking different language to a tree. We have communication because we live around each other. And every person has a perspective and a vantage point that's valid and worthy of being heard. Not every person will defend or support or bolster up their perspective with like hard-hitting facts and analysis.
Yeah.
But everybody has the right to be heard.
Mm-hmm.
And in order to do that, we must have communication. The thing that we don't talk about when we talk about communication, and as a almost graduate level student, you should always be looking for, how can I improve? What is my next question?
Oh, yeah.
Your next question is, all of your questions have revolved around how do we speak to each other, which also, which misses a very important part of communication, which is listening to other people. Like you and I are communicating right now, but I'm the only one talking. Your role is you're listening, and that is essential to communication. If you don't have a listener, then you again are stranded in the middle of the woods and you're talking to a tree.
Yes.
So, one of the things that in further research that would be worth looking at is what is the role of the listener, and how can we become better listeners in order to understand each other better.
Yeah. Wow. Thank you for your time and your
All
answers.
16 minutes and 30 seconds of it.
It's all good. All right, last but certainly not least, my Youth Explore the World class. We read a bunch of different books from different places in the world, and a theme that kept coming up was just how differently people communicate based on where they are from, what they've experienced, what they've lived through, and what values their own culture holds. In some cultures, communication can be very direct, saying exactly what you mean. In some, it's more indirect, preserving harmony, showing humility. Nonverbal cues are really important. Eye contact, space, tone of voice. We read literature based in different parts of the world, and it was interesting to see the differences between those communications, like in a much deeper way. And when I was sitting here thinking of the things I could talk about, I thought this class might be cool to talk about. And then I really started thinking about it, and it made me realize that good communication isn't about saying all the right things. It's about being curious about what other people have to say and being adaptable. The woman that you're about to hear from, her name is Pat. She has just such an interesting life. She is a child of deaf parents, and she has deaf family members. And so she actually has a really cool story in this interview that I'm really excited for you guys to hear. It's kind of sweet, but it's really cool to just see how we adapt our communication depending on who we're talking to and what their background is and all those things. So I'm super excited for you guys to hear. I am here with Pat Decaro, a retired faculty member of the National Technical Institute for the Deaf. She's a child of deaf parents and other deaf family members. Hello, Pat.
Hello.
If you could define communication in your own words, what would you say?
I would say that communication is intentional, reciprocal between two or more people, informative, and comes in various forms: text, speech, face and body language, especially in sign language.
Yeah.
And code between people who share the code and know what it is.
Yeah.
And informative.
Wow, that was really great. Do you think age, culture, and background affect how people communicate? And how have you handled that in your work and personal life?
Age, definitely. People communicate very strangely with children. Very, very high, speech.
Yeah.
And very simple. But also, to the elderly, there is a difference in communication. A lot of things like oh, hello, dear, and can I help you, dear?
Yeah.
Things like that, where old people are considered often to need more help understanding things. So age makes a difference. Culture makes a difference. It's, in a way, it's the same. When a person is communicating with somebody of a different culture, if their English isn't perfect, then people tend to, and not talk down to, but tend to make their sentences simpler.
Yeah.
So, yeah. So culture makes a difference. And in the case of sign language, people really don't understand that facial and body expressions are part of the language.
Yeah.
And they are, so it's really important to know that. For example, one of the things that is very annoying is that people who don't know sign language try to get your attention with one finger tapping on your shoulder or one finger. And that means right away, I need your attention now.
Okay.
On the other hand, if it's not a one finger and you don't need their attention right away, you put your whole hand gently on the other person.
Okay.
And
I didn't
they
know
understand that this is not urgent. So there's all kinds of things that get in the way of communication because they're different. And that would be the same with different cultures. What else?
Are there phrases or approaches that you use to make tough conversations more productive? This is a question that I was basing off of a bioethic class that I took, which, we're dealing with some pretty heavy topics in that class. And the point of this question was to get at how do we make those difficult conversations a little bit more productive?
Yeah. What I do is I start by saying to a person, I know that we may have different opinions, but I'd really like to understand your opinion. I'd like to understand why you have that, and please educate me. So that often works.
Yeah, in these times, that's a really great way, I feel like, to approach that.
Yeah. Just to say that, look, I'm not going to be judgmental.
Yeah.
I just don't understand. So I'm not saying I do that all the time, but but I should.
Yeah, I should too.
Okay.
How do you adapt your communication when talking to people with different levels of experience or understanding?
That changes by, in the sense that if I know I'll start over. If I know their experience, I will speak directly to that. And it may be a simpler form of communication. Or, once again, I may be asking them about their experience, but different levels of information. I will try to speak to that same level. If it's somebody who knows all kinds of things about biology, then I will discuss it at that level, because I'm also a biologist. So I try to match what they have.
Yeah.
And in terms of sign language, there are deaf people who sign very fluent American Sign Language. There are deaf people who know some, but not a lot. There are deaf people who have been raised oral. And so I remember a story that my mother told me, that at one point when I was little, there were a group of people at our house, and she asked me to go find out who wanted what, for what kind of drink. And I went around the room, and apparently my language changed totally depending on who I was talking to.
Wow.
So if it was ASL, I used ASL. If it was speech and lip reading, I made sure that they could read my lips, etc. I mean, I just matched whatever their level of communication was. So that's a story that I don't remember, but I was told.
Wow.
So, yeah, go ahead.
To finish up, in your opinion, why is communication important, not just in your experience with work, but just in your life experience as in general?
Communication is critical. And without communication, there is misunderstanding. There are mistakes. There would be no government without communication. There would be no community without communication. So communication really affects everything, which is why we have to have it. And these days, we're not doing so well with that.
Yeah.
People are not talking to other people. They're not listening to other people. And so there's a lot of misunderstanding. And the government is not doing so well.
Yeah.
Yeah. So it's really critical. And we need to work harder at it.
I agree.
Yeah. Have I answered that?
Yeah, I think
Okay.
so.
Okay.
Wow. Okay. Thank you so much for answering those questions for me.
Oh, you're very welcome.
Putting everything all together, I learned a lot in the classes that I've taken at NAS so far. I know I'm going to learn so much more, but in terms of communication, I see it so much more than just what we say to one another now. It is a skill, and it's a responsibility, and it's a form of healing. And whether we're helping a patient feel safe, whether we're navigating ethical dilemmas or learning how to connect to people across a culture barrier, communication has the ability to shape the outcome of that. And when we do it with empathy and intention, it has so much power to build trust and foster understanding and just bring people closer together. So thank you guys so much for listening. I want to once again thank the people I interviewed, Eric, Mike, and Pat, for sharing their experiences and sharing their work with you and me. And yeah, I encourage you guys all as listeners to this to reflect on how you guys communicate, especially in maybe some tough or unfamiliar situations. Until next time, maybe. Thank you.